Hi, I'm Paul Pourcy. I'm actually the lead urban specialist here in the World Bank office in China. Welcome everybody. It's actually the first time that I'm talking in a virtual environment like this one, but I'm very happy to do so. But sorry if I make any mistakes. It's kind of interesting to talk to a screen and without seeing you. I've been working here in China since 2010. I've been working mostly in the urban sector as sector coordinator, but most recently I've become the program leader for what is called the Transport, Water, and now Urban GP. And in this capacity, I've been lucky to be able to travel around China quite a bit. I've been seeing quite a lot of different realities of China. And what you realize is that China is not a single country, it's actually a continent. We all know it's the largest country in terms of population with 1.3 billion people. And since, very recently, since 2011, most of these people have been living in urban areas, and it's continued to grow rapidly. It is quite interesting to see these different realities, ranging from these modern cities like Shanghai, Beijing, to the smaller cities and counties that you see, in the western side of China. So I'm going to give you a snapshot. There are always counterfactuals to things that I will be saying here. The good thing is there's a lot of positive, good, let's say, examples in China that we can learn from. And there are certain things where China can learn from other countries. And I will be trying to highlight some of these things that China can work on, especially focusing on urban planning and land use. When you look at China, actually, the urbanization rate is not so unique in terms of relative terms. You see a lot of countries, especially in this region, like Korea, Japan, Malaysia, that have gone through a similar rate of urbanization. The difference being, of course, is that China, because of its large population, is dealing with a much higher volume. And if you look forward, let's say, there will be another 250 to 300 million people moving to cities in the next 20 to 30 years. So, we have to say this is a daunting task. And having worked in many different countries, including Latin America, and in also other countries in East Asia, I've never seen this type of scale of issues as I've seen in China, which makes it a very interesting but also a very challenging place to work in. If you look to the urbanization rate of China, it is actually a little bit lower than expected from where it is in terms of income per capita. You see, let's say, compared to other countries, it is urbanizing, but it's still lagging behind. And of course, we all know, probably most of you know, that this is partially due to the hukou system, which basically contains some of that development or that urbanization process, and basically have left maybe some people that normally would have gone to cities still living, back in the countryside. Now here you see that actually the urbanization process in China has been able to shift the economy from what is a very industrial base to more of services, and it's exactly what the Chinese government has put forward as the challenge. They see urbanization as an important vehicle to help, cities and help the country move from what is now a very industry, export-oriented economy to more of a service-oriented, higher-level manufacturing and more innovative economy. This is actually the next phase of China and China's urbanization process, which will require quite some different ways of planning, less of the top-down and more of the market-oriented. And I will basically try to highlight some of these changes that need to happen over time and in the next, decades for China to really become, highly competitive, and cities in China to become highly competitive and conducive for innovation. Here you see, I think, which is probably one of the greatest challenges, and I have gotten a question from one of the participants before this presentation, which was asking about the social issues. We talk a lot about sustainability, about the environment, but what about the social equity issues? And I think this will become probably one of the major challenges for China as it moves forward. I will not go in this presentation in great detail, but social inequality and, let's say, this growing, inequality between rich and poor will have to be dealt with, and probably will be one of the critical issues that China will have to face as it moves forward, in the urbanization process. This is a kind of a map of China. The light blue, it's not very clear, but I hope you will have the presentation later on. But the light blue basically shows where populations have been decreasing. Yellow is a kind of a stable levels of population, and the darker reds and the purples are where Chinese population have been growing. And as you can see, basically the big urban agglomerations of China, Beijing, the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta, Guangzhou, are the areas where still most of the people are moving to. So the pattern of urbanization actually in China has followed very similar patterns as other countries in the world. You have a couple of leading cities, large cities, that drive the economy, and then you have a whole tail end of smaller cities. And if you compare, despite all of the intentions that the government have had over the last 10, 20 years to basically contain development in these large metropolitan areas, the reality is that these cities over the last 10 years, 15 years have still seen the highest level of growth. In the cities where I live, where I'm now talking from, Beijing, Beijing back in 2000 had only 13 million people. We are now getting close to 23 million. So almost like a doubling of population in 15 years time. And I always say to Beijing, be ready for becoming a city of 40 million. That's a better strategy than containing yourself or trying to say, let's not grow further than 25 or 30. In reality, this city will be able to attract and should be able to attract more people. The critical thing really is how then you provide the necessary infrastructure for this not to become further congested, polluted as it is right now. It has to really deal with a lot of these issues of pollution and connectivity to be able to cope with the further growth. I always like this slide because it basically puts forward why I'm in this sector and why we believe in urban areas. We really believe that in urban agglomerations you get these benefits from the urbanization process, which is higher productivity, higher competitiveness, the innovation because you get, let's say, more exchanges of knowledges and transfers and synergies and connectivity of people. And also from the service delivery side, from our sector where we work a lot in, which is water and sanitation and transport, cities provide a much better system for us to provide these services a lot more efficiently. Secondly, they also, at one hand, they have a lot more diverse opportunities. I really say, the reason why people come to cities is because they look for jobs and they look for, opportunities for further growth, but also to specialize. The know-how, a lot of the intelligence of the world is basically driven by the large and maybe less large, but by the cities of the world. And it is actually through these cities that you get access to local, global markets. But as we all know, we need to address some of the externalities. We need to address the issues of congestion, pollution, which is a daily reality. Actually, I have a sore throat because the last 3 days we have had some bad, not so good pollution in Beijing. We have also, of course, in this particular area of the country, a lot of issues with water scarcity and the carrying capacity of the environment in general. So we need to take these things into account as well as the natural hazards and so on. If you look to the urbanization process, despite this humongous growth and humongous migration of people from, let's say, the rural areas to cities, it is interesting to see that densities have actually decreased. The urban densities have decreased over the last, let's say 10, 15 years. Meaning, spatially speaking, cities have grown much faster than, the population growth. And that is kind of a little bit unexpected. You see the real strong growth in urban population, yet, at the same time, very different from other cities in East Asia. You have seen a decline in the actual density, so there are less people living per square kilometer. And I love this picture because this picture, shows you, the dark, the black is 2000, and the red is 2010. Basically the urban construction area. These are taken from satellite pictures and is actually part of a recent study that the World Bank did on East Asia, changing urban landscape, where we looked into many different metropolitan areas around East Asia and really looked at them spatially. And what is so striking about China, and you see it here as well, is that cities have really grown very rapidly spatially. There's a humongous increase of urban construction land added to the cities. And while densities, when you go to downtown areas of Chinese cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, are still pretty high, 20,000, 30,000, sometimes even 40,000 people per square kilometer. As soon as you move into the suburban areas, densities drop dramatically. And as we know, and I always mention this, densities are not the enemies of cities, they are the biggest allies of cities. Of course, we need to manage them well with very articulated transport systems and very walkable places for people to live. But the biggest problem of cities is sprawling, because sprawling will inhibit the affordability of a lot of other modes of transport, more efficient modes of transport. And very often people that live in the suburban areas of our cities, the only way in Washington, where most of you maybe are, or a lot of you are participating in, one of the biggest problems is actually people that move from the suburban areas into the cities, and the only way to do so is by using motorized transport, and that creates actually the pollution. It's not the density of the downtown area, but it is actually the lack of density in a lot of the suburban areas. You can solve it by creating, of course, more dense nodes in the suburban areas, but again, density needs to be the biggest ally for, let's say, the further development of cities. Now, I've talked a little bit about these density issues. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but critically speaking, one of the great drivers of this very rapid spatial expansion of cities is the current, let's say, dual land system, where you have the rural collectively owned land and the urban construction land, which very often is auctioned through competitive pricing mechanisms. So there's a humongous win for governments that expropriate collective owned land, landowners, farmers, to then resell that land through auction, and they can make a lot of money out of that conversion. So there is a real basic, let's say, financial need behind it, because also with some of the decentralization processes that happened here over the last 20 years, since '94, there's a lot of more responsibilities now at the local level, but there is a lack of revenues that now the government is trying to address through this new budget law that was just enacted in January. So there will be changes happening, and the government realizes it. But I just want to demonstrate that some of this sprawling has nothing to do with cities needing more people, but they need the revenue to basically be able to finance the infrastructure and provide some of the services. At the same time, within the cities themselves, there is still this allocation of land for industries, without using the auction, which is a more competitive, more market-oriented process. So there is a lot of suboptimal use and very large pieces of land that is basically used for industries, because industrialization and urbanization up to now still were going hand in hand, and very often industrialization was seen as the way of providing the jobs for the people that were moving to the cities. And at the same time, contrary to many other countries in the world, the VAT, the value-added taxation, is actually collected at the production side in China, not at the consumption side. So people need, or governments need, these industries to be in their cities to actually, again, raise the revenues for the cities. So clearly speaking, we need to, at one hand, have some reforms, and I think the rural land reform actually will help cities. It talks a lot about, let's say, let's say we need rural land reform, or we need to contain the sprawl of cities because, let's say we need to protect agricultural land. But at the end of the day, as I was saying before, the critical thing is that we need to protect our own cities. So we need to basically avoid this sprawling of cities into the countryside, and because we want to create more efficient, more dense cities. This will require a reform of the rural land, and basically a more competitive allocation, even our competition of land, even from the rural side, in equal terms with urban land, so that people that own rural land can reap the full benefits of the value of their land, and that they also can get better revenues from maybe even the exploitation of that land. This is also something that is gradually being considered. There are a lot of pilots going on in different parts of China, but I think it is at a critical step for Chinese, let's say, development of cities, that this rural land reform is pushed through rather quickly. The other thing, as I said before, is this, over-reliance of city on land-based revenues. Again, the budget law that was enacted recently is already taking care of a lot of these issues, or some of these issues. But basically, we need to provide now an alternative. If basically this new budget law will restrain cities from, converting land, there's also a lot of regulations by the Land Resources Bureau that will restrict more so the conversion of rural to urban land. There needs to be something else that comes in place. And again, local property taxes seems to be a very logic way. This is something that a lot of cities, a lot of countries have used to basically give a much more steady stream of revenues than the reliance of cities on one-off sales of land that bring in a lot of money at once, but don't give them a very long stream of revenues to do more long-term rational planning of investment, capital investment, and other investment that are needed. And of course, the other thing, what I mentioned before already, is VAT as a way to basically boost, let's say, the service sector by having the VAT really being collected at the consumer side. Basically, follow the people instead of follow the production, because people are the ones that build our cities. So the more people are consuming in a certain city, more taxation should be raised in those places, so that it can provide the services that these citizens need. There are many other ways, and and we will talk a little bit about it, but also to do better optimal and optimization of land use, which will then basically increase revenues for cities as well. Let me just quickly go over some of the policy recommendations that we have. And again, I don't intend to be completely comprehensive here. We have only 20 minutes to 30 minutes to talk about the topic. And for sure, I'm sure there will be questions coming in. We also have the report. But here are some of the critical recommendations that our team that worked on this Urban China report towards efficient, inclusive and sustainable urbanization came up with. And one would be, very simply said, have, let's say, the market work better and more actively. And one way is move away from land quotas and growth restrictions. Very often they leapfrog development beyond this, and actually it would be much better to have an all, let's say, uniform land system, which every land use rights should be auctioned, or at least being taken away, or being transferred through a competitive process. Secondly, there needs to be some more flexibility in the system in terms of being able to adjust. As we know, China is investing a lot in infrastructure, and there's a lot of opportunity to basically improve or increase, let's say, FARs and create more flexible, more mixed land uses, especially around some of the nodes of transport. Very important is, very often what we see is that land, yes, is transferred to a developer, they start developing, but the secondary land market is not very vibrant. It is possible, they will always tell you, yes, you can buy from another developer and there's ways for the market to work, but the regulatory implications, even to change zoning from what is once zoned industry to a zoning of commercial or other type of zoning, is extremely tedious, inhibiting again the market to work quite well and quite, let's say, rapidly. And one thing we have been discussing quite a bit is the issue of property taxes as a way to densify, to bring investment back to the cities. I like to always give this example of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, after the, let's say, the restructuring of their economy and the move of the steel industries, maybe partially to China even, they were dealing with a lot of vacant land within their city, and they actually taxed vacant land higher than occupied land. And it was quite interesting, because what it created was an incentive for people that owned vacant land to either sell it or develop something to make money out of it, because if not, they would be paying a huge amount of taxation. And in that way, they basically created a much more vibrant land market. And this graph on the right, where you see Guangzhou and Seoul, the white graph is Guangzhou and the green is Seoul. You see again what I said before, is that Guangzhou has a very dense inner city, but very often, let's say, underneath you see this very quick decline in densities, while in Seoul and Tokyo and many of the other larger Asian cities, there's a much more gradual transition in terms of density. And again, there's a humongous opportunity for redevelopment or infill development within the existing cities instead of greenfield development at the fringes of the city. Now, one issue, and you will hear this a lot in China, is the issue of the superblock. And again, let's say a lot of the blocks and the zoning in China is done at a very, very large scale. Actually, where I live, one block is 1.5 by 1.5 kilometers. And this has one residential zone. So in Manhattan, if you would add up all of the plots in Manhattan, you talk about 300,000 plots. And a colleague of mine always say, in the same area in China, you have about 250 different plots. So 300,000 against 250, you see the difference in terms of the granularity of options, of having different types of zone, much more mixed zones, but also to bring in, let's say, much smaller developers, individuals that can also start buying land and trading land and so on. So setting, let's say, the smaller blocks will also allow for a lot more vibrant land markets to work beyond just, the issues of let's say, the humongous empty spaces, the Le Corbusier type of developments where you have these high-rise buildings that you see here with humongous green spaces in between that are very often fenced off and are not part of the public space. With smaller scale type of developments, we will create a much more smaller scale connectivity that will really connect people to people and will create much more vibrant cities and much more interesting cities than this new type of developments. And it is nice to see, because we have actually compared Puxi and Pudong, which are in the same city, Shanghai. Puxi being the old part of the older part of Shanghai, and Pudong, this new area with all these high-rise buildings. And when you look to the density, the gross urban density, actually Pudong's density, despite all of these large high-rise buildings, is much lower, because at the end of the day, a lot of the space is taken away by the large roads, by the humongous setbacks. So there is actually opportunity for densification in these areas, and China can learn from China. We are not bringing in any new examples from outside. We're actually using some of the good examples of China of how they should basically be developing, cities in the future at a much more smaller and more integrated and connected space. This brings me to maybe one of my last big recommendations of the team, which is this issue of connectivity. As I was saying in the beginning, I think China has done a remarkable job in building the high-speed rail, the metros, and highways. It's mind-boggling the amount of investments and the amount of roads and let's say public transport systems that have been put in place in cities around China. Yet what you see, and this upper picture shows you quite well, very often around stations there are these humongous big plazas and open spaces, and these stations are not very well connected to the rest of the city, and very often transport plans don't talk to the urban plans. So again, there's a lot to be learned from other cities in the world, and actually this is exactly what China needs to do, is basically do the last mile, what we call the last 500 meters connectivity. Really create around these large nodes of infrastructure, be it metro, be it high-speed rail, the smaller scale neighborhood level connections, with walkable streets, with mixed land uses and so on, so that you have at this small scale the livable communities where people want to live, that are as well connected to the rest of the economy through well-designed and rapid transit systems. So I think China has the basis for that. They have done a lot of things right with the large infrastructure, but it's now time to basically go for the next level of connectivity, which will very much link to the new type of economy that China is looking for. But it will basically require, again, more flexible land regulations and more, let's say, private-oriented development, where we will see what is the private sector willing to invest in. We have very interesting case studies from King Cross in London, places around Manhattan in New York, where even in those cities which you think are extremely dense, there's still room for, you know, making better use of land, and basically create, even at that local level, good, vibrant communities for people to live and work and play and interact, because that is what will basically create innovation for China. Now, I think the most critical part, of course, is for China and for the Chinese government and cities to understand kind of changing role. It doesn't mean government should not play a role. Actually, government will continue to play an essential role in the process, but it's slightly different. It's less prescriptive. I always give the example that China should, or the government should not be sitting anymore in the driver's seat, but should be, you know, more being the police and let other people drive and make sure that they stay within the regulation and within, you know, the zoning plans, but allow for some flexibility to happen. You know, allow people to buy different cars, to, you know, mix a little bit up, you know, what they want to do, and basically guide the process without being always sitting in the front seat. Second, on the zoning and density issue, I think this issue of FARs, you know, the floor area ratios, it is extremely important that these become a little bit more flexible in the master plans, in the zoning of China, because very often they are very rigid, and as cities develop, as realities change, as areas within the city become more accessible, very often the plans are not adapted as quickly as they should be. Even here where I work, we are right next to a station. Finally now, 10 years after the station was opened, or even more, you know, that there is a certain level of densification happening with some new buildings coming around Guomao where we work. But it's a very long and tedious process to change zones, to basically create this more intense development around stations. And again, density doesn't mean that you cannot protect the green space. There was a question about, you know, will basically, you know, more density, you know, push out, you know, let's say public space and so on. No. We have quite some examples where basically through smart regulations you can have developers protect certain green spaces within the city while they are allowed to maybe increase the density of their own development. So again, it's being smart about the development. We definitely need to protect you know, green space. More important than the large, big urban spaces or green spaces, it actually have a lot of small, very accessible parks, little plazas where people can basically come to, very accessible from their house. What I see a lot here are these very large, open, big size green spaces, which everybody says, see, we have a lot of green space, but very often a lot of the people that are living farther away don't have access or are too far away from that space, or that space is also not very friendly and inducive for people to use it. And then, of course, critical is also to stop this fragmented development. I didn't talk about it too much, but there's a lot of these, you know, single developments happening outside of the city, and these eco-city type of developments, you know, where probably the rebound effect or the investments in infrastructure that is needed for developing the city will create more emissions than the savings in the next 100 years from zero emissions. So critical for the sustainability of cities and the urbanization process to really bring investments back, use the infrastructure that was already created by the government and is here now, and optimize the use of it, you know, by basically densifying these issues and using pricing mechanisms to attract or disincentivize development farther away from the city. So I will stop here. It is exactly a half an hour, so I don't want to, you know, dwell on too long. I have a couple of questions to see whether people have listened to it. But the critical thing really is to optimize land use by better regulating the land market. The land market in China is still very, you know, let's say, very regulated. It is possible, the market is working, but it's not working to the extent it could be with, you know, investments in infill development and bringing more private sector and also some smaller scale private investors into the realm of the urbanization process. Again, it means slightly different, you know, plan zonings are important. We have them everywhere in the world, but in many other places it's slightly more flexible. There are options for cities and developers to increase densities, to mix zoning, depends on a good plan, and people can then review these plans and accept these changes to happen based on clear market signals. Again, we have this land use is very often fragmented, residential, commercial, industrial. In the new economy, as industries become less polluting and the economy becomes more service oriented, actually mixing it is the best way to go. There's a lot of opportunity for mixing clean technology type of businesses with residential areas, with commercial areas, with recreational areas, and really create kind of mini living neighborhoods where everything can happen within even larger cities. And of course, the other thing, and this I think resonates especially in the second tier and third tier cities, is really understand before you start planning, is to really understand what you are, let's say, what is your city, what are the strengths of your city, what does your economy looks like. Very often we see these very long-term visionary plans about cities. We want to become the new Shenzhen type of city, but if you don't understand what your local economy is doing and what its strength is and how it can connect to other economies, your plan will not succeed. And again, this is not, we see quite some successful success stories in China, but quite a number of secondary cities are struggling, having too much of a forward-looking approach while not understanding sometimes enough about their own shortcomings or barriers or opportunities that they have in building their own economy. Finally, and this is I think the big new urbanization strategy as the government is putting forward, and is basically also something that we have been put forward, is less focus on quantity, on more infrastructure. It's really about the quality and the efficiency. I think that is really a different type of prioritization of what city needs to do and where city needs to go to. And it is actually very good to see that the cadre system, which is basically the merit system for local managers, mayors, is actually already changing. It was very driven by GDP growth, and you already see that it is now more balanced, looking into other issues, environmental issues. So I really believe, at one hand, that China has a great opportunity. They have a strong basis. It's one of the countries that I felt like they really want to take in, the knowledge from around the world. They are very open to understand what others are doing, and where I've seen a lot of other countries putting plans somewhere on the shelf, they really try to implement them. So again, I think as China will become the largest economy of the world, I also believe that it probably will have in the next 10, 20 years, some of the greatest and best cities of the world. Let me stop here. Thank you so much, and let me see if we can go to the question. So let me ask quickly a first question, which is, what is one of the characteristic or a special feature of the urbanization process in China? Yes. Okay. This is very interesting. It's I can see here that absolutely true that everybody agreed that it didn't avoid the sprawling of cities, and that's absolutely true. Basically, it has increased the density of cities. No, it has not. If you look on average, that is the one big thing that we have found, which is kind of surprising to us. And there's one graph where I show this, is basically that it did not increase the density of the city. The rate of urbanization, and it was a little bit of a tricky answer, because if you look to the absolute rate, there was this beautiful graph that I showed where also Malaysia, Japan, and some other countries like Korea have had an even higher rate of urbanization. What is so unique about China is actually that it had this sheer volume of people. Let's say if you talk about a rate of 1% in China, you talk about 100 million people, or sorry, 10 million people. So, in terms of real numbers, it is unprecedented. But the rate itself was not so unprecedented. What is really quite startling, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, is that the returns on capital investments have been quite low. So China has been investing a lot in infrastructure, and some of you have seen the reports on the ghost towns and some of these cities that are being planned outside of, let's say the big urban agglomerations that are not really attracting a lot of, people. Those are basically some of the problems that China faces with, the unprecedented, let's say, returns on capital, which have been quite low, and especially after the crisis in 2008, where the Chinese government has really pumped quite a lot of money in further infrastructure investment to keep the government or the economy floating. So, but unfortunately, not all of these investments were able to basically get the returns that they needed to have. Now, just to say that I think if you go to the big cities in Shanghai, the returns on investments are incredibly high, and these larger scale infrastructure like railways and highways and airports also have a very high rate of return on investment. The critical issue is really planning these new places. Let me go to question number 2. I see already we are on question 2. Why is rural land reform so important for the urbanization process in China? 1 is to reduce incentives for land conversion in peri-urban areas. 2, to increase agricultural productivity and food security for cities. 3, to increase farmers' revenues for land sales. All of the above. Oops, it's already closed. Another tricky one. I'm sorry. I actually, indirectly there might be more than reason, but the real reason really is to reduce incentives for land conversion. That is why for urban areas it's so important that we kind of have a uniform land market, because if land values in the peri-urban areas and agricultural land would be valued at their real, value, there would be less incentives, and the profits that governments would make out of the conversion of rural to urban land would be much lower. Basically, having, let's say, a rural reform will not necessarily, with other policies, increase productivity. It is, of course, we need higher productivity of food, and we also need to secure food for the cities, but it's not necessarily through a land reform that we will increase productivity in rural areas. And to increase farmers' revenue from land sale is absolutely true. It's not saying that is not true. That will happen, but it will not necessarily mean much for the urbanization process. It will be great for the farmers, and I'm very happy that they will get more revenues out of it. But in terms of why it is so important for the urbanization process, the real right answer would be to really reduce the incentives for land conversion in peri-urban areas. Question 3. This must be easy, I hope. If not, I need to give you a new lecture after this. Bad because they create unsafe environments, bad because they increase pollution and congestion, good because they allow for more efficient public service delivery, good because there will be less people in rural areas. Okay, the poll is in. I've tried to say that for cities, one of the biggest allies is densities. Of course, we need to be careful. We cannot just put people in, one specific area and increase densities without providing the other services. But without the right high densities, it's very difficult for cities to manage, the provision of services to create, let's say, more livable, compact areas that are well connected. So at the end of the day, I really believe densities are good for the cities, and very often the congestion, pollution that happens in cities is not caused by the density of let's say, of the inner city areas, but it's caused, either by pollution of industry somewhere, outside of the cities. It's caused by the people that live in low density areas that have to drive into our cities with their cars and vehicles that provide that create the congestion. So again, we need to be careful. I should actually make a little kind of side remark that what we very often use is not simply the word density, but what we call articulated density, which means density in conjunction with very good infrastructure. Let me go to the last question, and then I will open up for some other questions from the audience. I actually saw a question 4 before, but maybe it's gone already. So let's go to some questions that other people. Oh, there it is. Okay, so why is coordination between land use and transport policy so important? Now, the good thing about this question is nobody can be wrong, because it's actually all of the answers that are above. So at one hand, if we coordinate it well, we can basically encourage the densification and mixed use around transit stations. That is exactly what happens, when we actually have these policies go hand in hand. And a lot of the problems that we have when areas densify without proper transport systems, then we create congestion and we create the pollution. Of course, if we have created these dense areas, and of course in conjunction with good public transport systems, we can avoid people using vehicles and other types of transport. We can create also much more walkable communities within these high density areas within next to transit system. And at the end of the day, we could reduce pollution overall in the city by doing it. And I think it is, at the end of the day, at the heart of a lot of the sustainability issues of cities, is good plans and good urban form will actually induce, a lot of the emission reductions, a lot of the reduction in land resource use, and so on. And finally, there's a humongous opportunity, and we didn't talk too much about it in this particular lecture, but there is actually a lot of, let's say, opportunity to capture more value out of land. If you know that we are building stations in certain areas, and we know that we are improving the public transport system in certain areas, then naturally, let's say, the rent values will go up. But if we don't have the mechanisms in place to capture this value added of this land, and where we can really use some of this value added to finance infrastructure, this is probably one of the critical areas that we, the World Bank, are working with in a lot of the Chinese cities and with the Chinese the government, is to really see how we can. Let me now see if there's any questions from the audience. I see everyone here. Oops. Yes. Oh, I have people from Madagascar. Okay, this is. Yes. No, sprawl is actually into, let's say, the rural area. So the city boundaries, I have a question here from Banasri Banerjee. Is the urban sprawl on rural land surrounding cities or within city boundaries? Now, it is actually going into surrounding cities. And actually what you have seen in China quite a bit is that sometimes rural villages that used to be really away from the city have been incorporated in the city, and they are now urban villages, very often not entirely integrated into the city because of the cost of relocation and cost of let's say resettlement. So people kind of leave them aside, governments leave them aside, but we have quite a number of what is called urban villages, which used to be rural villages, but now are incorporated. So all of the rural land around these villages has been sold, has been urbanized, but the village itself remains there. Well, that's another good question from, again, Manoj about how long do you think these fiscal reforms will take? Is there a strategy for implementation? Now, it's never easy. I think they will take some time. The government has already enacted this law, the new budget law, which I think, is under implementation, restricting greatly the ability of cities to raise revenues from land and using special purpose vehicles to basically borrow from the market. But I think there's still quite a work to do, as I mentioned in my presentation, in terms of broadening the tax revenue. As you know, taxation is never a nice topic for people if you suddenly tell them that there will be a new tax, a property tax. So it will take some time for let's say the full reform to be implemented. But I can see, they have already started. The start has been made. So basically, basically made because, it has to be changed, and the government is seeing that it cannot go on as it did before. Yes, Mr. Yu Zhou, you say, Zhou Yu, I should say in Chinese, the collective owned land in most suburban areas is difficult to auction. Yes, under the current circumstances it's impossible. But if you could create a real uniform land mechanism. Now, of course, we need, before you can start doing that, to really define very well the rights of farmers. Under the collective ownership type of arrangement, it's very difficult to have a real market working. But if you would really set forward a process of making rural land and making these reforms of ownership and tenure in rural areas more clear, definitely there would be a possibility for rural land to be auctioned. But it would be at a much higher price, and probably less investment would go in the peri-urban areas because that land would become a lot more expensive. Land quota exists much because of the bottom line of the 1.8 billion euro of farmland. From Meicheng Wang, Wang Meicheng. Do you think this is still necessary to maintain this red line? I think for the time being I would be in favor, but I think if, as things evolve, as the market would play a more decisive role, as they like to say, it becomes less necessary. But then we really need to have, again, what I said before, this rural land to become, completely auctioned at the same pricing as the rest of the land. And farmers in the rest of the world, actually, that live close to cities, get humongous amounts of land if they sell their land. So it is not cheap for developers. They will think twice when they buy farmland in some of the suburban areas of cities around the world, because it is very expensive. There still will be the issue of zoning, so the government still has the possibility of not zone certain areas for urban development. So even though you buy rural land, it doesn't mean that you can suddenly start building, all kind of, developments there. So there will be restrictions there. Mr. Pengfei, Li Pengfei, this is always an interesting question, and I will not give you the right answer. There are differences in culture between Eastern and Western, like character, belief, and so on. So whether there are any consideration about culture in the reform, yes, I definitely believe there is, and I don't hope that I'm putting my Western values up to the Chinese, because I think the Chinese millennial values are so much more interesting. And I actually would like China to much more pick up on their old values, the feng shui, the way the hutons were designed, the smaller scale community level development that China had historically. Actually, it has copied some of the bad sides, the big roads, the vehicles, the large buildings from the Western culture, while I think, the local culture has a lot to offer, and actually we need to basically go back and base our cities and our development on the culture of China here in China, as we do in other countries. I think at the end of the day, there are some common issues. I always say people, if you would ask 20 different people from 20 different countries, what are some of the most livable cities in the world in your opinion? The group of cities would be very similar, because at the end of the day, as a human being, we have very similar needs in terms of interaction, in terms of community, and cities are actually places where we create this level of community, and we basically come together and laugh and interact and so on. And this is not unique Western, Eastern, North, and Southern. This is actually our human being, and in our human being, that is the kind of a thing that we are looking for. Let me see a lot of. I even cannot read the question. I will just read them and then see if I can answer. Joe, you again question. A town and rural planning is becoming popular in China. Is a trend to enhance localism and discretion, or is it still a top-down model? Yes, I would like to see it to be more of an even more community level development. I still see too much of this being top-down, although there is a lot of villagers being involved in the process. I still think there is still room to bring in more of this local culture into the design, into the planning of these towns. We are actually working in Henan, we are working in Shanxi on some of these rural villages, and it's still too much cookie cutter for me, like this very typical medium-sized buildings all in one row, one big street. While if you look into how these communities were put together by themselves over the years, 100 years, 200 years, they look a little bit different. They have more subtleties in terms of local, like culture, local design, that is sometimes lost in some of these new town development and so on. So I think there is definitely room for us to basically do better, and for China and these local communities to do better. Let me see here. Oh, second, Bennett, are the World Bank recommendations being considered in China as new? Oh, for sure, Banashri, for sure. Actually, we work with the DRC, which is the the Development Research Council, which is basically directly reporting to the State Council, and it's kind of a think tank for the Chinese government. So our urbanization study has been very much picked up. I'm not saying that word for word everything has been done, but this study really is influencing at the national level, and of course we are trying, as we see, certain things can be done at the local level, but some of these regulations that I mentioned before on planning, master planning, flexibility in zoning will require some changes at the national level, and we are very much working with the national government. But again, on their side, they also see, if we let it all go, will it not become a panacea? How can we make sure that there is some level of coherence in what cities do and what different places will follow? Will we create more chaos than we will solve? So I understand, and we are working with them to see how we have a very balanced and a gradual transition from this more centrally planned to more of an economy planned type of development. Liu Yan, thanks for your great presentation. I'm a PhD student. I have several questions. Yan Liu, I'm very happy to answer many of them, and maybe some of them might have to come to me later. I am actually what specific research team or department? I'm just a regular World Bank staff. I'm a TTL testing leader. I am actually in the urban GP, the SUR, famous SUR. So I'm working on project implementation here in China. But next to it, we spend some of our time also on this type of research, where we work together with academic institutions. I'm a real practitioner. I'm not an academic person, but I can learn a lot from the academicians and learn from them. As the land market is monopolized and controlled by the government, and also considering the social status of China, what role will your research play? Well, our research will hopefully play a role to open up it a little bit, and not saying without control or a role of the government, by changing the role of the government, for really become more of a regulator and less of a how would I say, a doer. A lot of the investments in China and a lot of the urbanization process has been done by the cities and by the government, and I think they need to do a little bit less. Let people, let businesses, let let's say, as we were saying before, the villagers do it. But you can regulate. You need to be there as a regulator. You need to make sure that it stays within certain boundaries, but give some freedom. A lot of the inefficiencies happen because of, the lack of ability of cities to adapt, of people to bring in their own, values into the system. Any suggestion for the social security assistance during the urbanization phase? Now, that is very critical. I'm not going to go into great detail, but our report dealt with a lot of the inclusiveness of the urbanization process, which actually deals with the hukou, integration of migrants, the poor people. As I said in the beginning, it is very critical for China to be able to basically give better services to ensure that there is a more equitable development that is shared among different people and among the different citizens, no matter where they come from, no matter where they go to. Let's say that they have an equal access to certain services. And I can tell you that the government is seriously looking into what are the options. It's not an easy proposition. Imagine you are Beijing, suddenly with 7-10 million new migrants. What will the current citizens say? Do we need to take care of all these new migrants? So answers are not easy, but I rest assured that people are thinking a lot, and we, the World Bank, are thinking with them on how we can do this, in place. Mr. Olero, are the proposed block size in urban settings already in place? No, unfortunately not. Still too much is done at the large scale, which is a little bit inherited of the old communist system, where you had the industries and the residents around, what is big, industries that would take care of their workers and everything else. So these big pieces of land were developed, that evolved into a system where for cities it was much easier to basically sell one piece of land to one developer and let him basically do this at once, instead of refining development at a much larger, smaller scale and then and do it. Yes, actually we don't have more time. No, I know. Thank you so much, everybody, and I will look into some of these questions, try to answer them offline, either